Hi everyone, welcome to class. So today we're still talking about chapter 1, but we're going to talk about C. Wright Mills, also known as the cowboy sociologist, the radical nomad, and the author of the Sociological Imagination. So the text covers sociological perspectives on social problems. He talks a little bit about essentially theory. We're not going to cover that in this lecture. We're going to move in the direction of C. Wright Mills, who he was, and how come I think he's important in terms of this class. Because we don't talk about C. Wright Mills often in sociology, and we don't actually read his books very often or his theories, but he was really important. I think especially when we're talking about social problems, he's a valid theorist to spend some time on. So our think, pair, share questions for today are discussion questions. Who was C. Wright Mills from your perspective? So this is your thought on this subject. I'd like you to define sociological imagination in your own words and give an example from your perspective. And what do you think of the old dead white guy problem in sociology? So let's get started. So let's start with the dead white dude problem. So essentially in sociology, we talk about what, you could kind of consider the holy trinity of theorists. It's Karl Marx, Emile Durkheim, and Max Weber, spelled Weber, W-E-B-E-R, but it's pronounced Weber. And so Durkheim, Weber, and Marx, we read extensively about those three theorists. Marx is the social conflict theorist. Durkheim is the structural functionalist, and Weber, he's kind of like an in-between. He's, I guess you could say he's micro level, but he takes the micro level context and makes it macro. And one of the reasons why this is an issue in sociology, but it's actually an issue probably everywhere, not probably, it is an issue within all of academia and our history of thought, is essentially that because of patriarchy, imperialism, colonialism, the history of academia, the history of thought, when we're talking about Plato, Socrates, I mean, even Diogenes, a very unusual philosopher. If you're interested in unusual radical philosophers, he was definitely one. It's the history of white male thought, and it's generally the history of privileged white males. So meaning they were wealthy, they were heterosexual, and they were white. And that's who was allowed to write. That's who was allowed to get an education. There is, some historians who talk about how women had invaded that space. We do have some writing from women historically, often though under the pseudonym of their husbands' names. So they would write under their husbands' names. They would hide their writing. They would, their intellectual work was hidden under sewing or poetry or craft or something like that. But historically, women and people of color have been excluded. They've been excluded from the intellectual conversations, from public conversations, from intellectual writing. And even to this day, you can largely get a degree, even an advanced degree, without having to read really truly anything from people of color or women in general, even in sociology. And so C. Wright Mills, in that he was, mid-century, so, 1956, I think he was born, 1950 something he was born. He didn't, he lived in, I want to say the 50s and 60s. I should probably look that up because I could totally be wrong, but I know it's around that time. He was bucking against that system, in the way that he looked at intelligentsia, the way he spoke, the way he dressed, all of those things. And it's still something that sticks with us today, that that maintaining the status quo and following the rules and, and agreeing with the history of a certain type of thinking. So for C. Wright Mills in general, one of the reasons why we don't read a lot of his work is because during his career, he was essentially kind of ostracized. He was known for not just being quirky, but also being rather belligerent, uncompromising. He very much had a disdain for the system, for the status quo, for society as a whole. He was always trying to go against the system. He was always criticizing the system, his peers, and not just the system in terms of, the power of elite, which he actually brings us those terms, the power elite, and explains to us who they are. But he was also bucking the system that he had direct contact with, which didn't bode well for him in terms of his own academic career. By the way, Karl Marx had the same problem. But he would do things like through his dress, refusing to wear a suit and tie when that was the uniform of the time. Instead, he would wear, his boots or his motorcycle chaps or, just not a suit and tie. And we could even see that today. If you make a connection today, if you have professors, especially female professors, we're often criticized for the way that we dress or not dressing professional enough. And if you pay attention, you'll notice your female professors are more likely to wear business attire, where your male professors are more likely to wear tennis shoes or jeans or t-shirts. And they often never receive any form of comment or criticism about the way they dress in their reviews, whereas female professors often receive this type of criticism or comment in their teaching reviews, as though it has a very much of a pertinent kind of connection to their intellectual capacity or their teaching methods. Mills, though, didn't just, try to buck the system in that way. He was often, fairly combative with his colleagues. He didn't get along so well with them. He was kind of an outsider. So he was more interested in, intellectual criticism, intellectual debate. And while he was very intelligent, and like many people who are very intelligent, he didn't see the point of following the norms and the values of the social structures. Unfortunately, creating a situation where today we don't necessarily read all of what he wrote. So he essentially has like 3 different things that he writes. He started off really with kind of this idea coming from Weber. So if you read Weber, if you've ever had a chance to read classical theory and Weber, Weber likes to take these concepts and create a definition or what he would call an ideal type, and then you would compare it. So what Mills does at the beginning is he takes this idea of power. He adopts it from Weber's definition of power. And he essentially says power is the ability to realize your own will, even when other people are resisting against your will. In other words, you don't have power unless you have power to assert your will despite being pushed against, despite other people telling you no. That's real power, according to Mills. And what Weber says is that the state itself has power. So that the state, it has power that's localized and that's particular to certain institutions. And, it's that idea of power, of asserting your will against other people's will. And that the state has power through essentially three different parts: the government, politics, and the economy. That's where our what we think of as the government has power, right? So it's the bureaucratic government, it's the political system, and it's the economic system. So the capitalists, the owners of wealth, the politics, and then the higher government. And he meant like military and like high generals and those type of people. They also have power. And this comes very much from a conflict perspective. So a Marxist, Karl Marx conflict perspective, which is antagonistic, right? So those who have power are in direct contrast to those who don't have power. From a Marxist perspective, it's the haves and the have-nots, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. So the bourgeoisie are the elite from that perspective, right? It's those very wealthy corporate owners. It's the people who control the economy, and it's the people who control the political system, which is often now people who are very wealthy, and it's those very high-ranking military officials. Those people are the haves. Those people are the bourgeoisie. Anybody who works for a living, even if they have a decent amount of money, like somewhat amount of money, they're not the true power elite. Those are that very top 1%. It's not the professors. It's not the doctor that drives a nice car. It's the people who can use their money to control political systems and change political systems for the masses of people. And so he essentially says that these powerful political systems, they both have access to, or they can usurp access, meaning they can take the access, right? And they can do it, either by force or what we today would say like passive force. They trick you into it essentially, or they take it while you're not looking. Through passive force is to kind of just push your way in without people realizing that that's what's happening. And what happens is they're that powerful. These institutions are that powerful because they use that access or that power or, the ability to control that access to shape the socio-political structures, meaning to shape how the system works. So we often talk about like how we have capitalism in our culture, and you may have heard of a monopoly, but you may not have heard of an oligopoly. Can't say it. And what that is essentially that there's just a few different organizations or companies that have so much power and they own so much that there's only a few companies that basically control everything or have all of the, they own everything, right? So we kind of know who a lot of these people are. The Koch brothers, now it's just one, the Waltons who own Walmart. These people are the people we don't even talk about, but these people can use their wealth and power to shape things like pushing down minimum wage. The biggest proponent against raising the minimum wage are the Waltons. And those people hire millions and millions of people all over the United States. They keep wages low, they keep minimum wage low, and they make sure that nobody has full-time job or a living wage or access to health care. And yet they're one of the richest families in the entire world. I mean, there's only like about between 10 and 20 families who have essentially more than 80% of all of the wealth in the entire world. And that's how rich these people are. And so what he was saying and what he pulls from Weber's definition is that these people, it used to be natural resources. At one point, the very wealthy, they colonized Africa and pulled all the natural resources out. And they can still do that today. We just recently had a political push towards opening up all the national parks so that those wealthy people could go in and take the oil and the water and everything else out of there. So they keep stripping natural resources, stripping social resources. They take wage labor. They take the healthiest years of your life, so that you can continue to build wealth for that family, so that you can continue to make them richer and richer and richer. So the resources all kind of have been accumulated at the very, very top. And by the way, Nestle, the company Nestle, owns almost all of the water rights in the world. He then talks about Mills wrote a book called White Collar, and it was on work. And so this is kind of his second contribution to sociology, to theoretical thought. And it's a critical analysis of work, essentially, of what it means for Americans to work. In, White Collar and Power Elite, he really deconstructs American society. He really takes a critical eye on American society and deconstructs and points out kind of all of the issues and problems structurally within the institutions, and critiques us, critiques our society's norms and our status quo. And then as he moves into the sociological imagination, C. Wright Mills starts to talk about our future. He starts to make prophecies kind of about our future, if you want to use that term. Let's talk about, just for a minute, the power elite. So Mills says, the power elite is a small group of individuals within high positions of powerful social institutions. So we just spoke about that, right? So it's the high-level political people, it's the generals, and it's the owners of wealth. So the people who own, like the CEOs that own basically all of the corporations. And this is his quote: "The class and status and power systems of local societies are not equally weighted. They're not autonomous. Like economic and political systems of the nation, the prestige and the power systems are no longer made up of decentralized little hierarchies," meaning what we would think of as, a normal capitalist society. He's basically saying they've all concentrated, right? Each having only a thin, distant connection, if any at all, within the others. They've all concentrated into a small group, and they're controlling essentially the world because we have a global economy today. So as he moves into the sociological imagination, he becomes more reflective, right? So much of his criticism before was external. He's talking about the social structures, the institutions, the system structures, right? But once he moves into sociological imagination, he starts to go more internal, right? Or intellectually within. So he's talking about the intellectual communities now. And he is criticizing other academics. He's criticizing intelligentsia, and he's saying that we're not doing everything that we can to reduce social ills. He's saying that we haven't done enough. He says that the ideals that we should have of reason and freedom, that they're in peril. And realize, he's saying this in the 50s and 60s, right? That we're complacent, that our system has been bureaucratized, right? It's a bureaucracy. And that the system of not just intelligentsia, but people, everyday people, we're distracted, and we're we're distracted with ourselves. At the time, he probably meant like television. People in Marx's time said, religion was the opiate of the masses. And then in the 90s, people would say television was the opiate of the masses. And today, people probably would say our phone and social media is the opiate of the masses, because you're distracted with social media and on your phone for 24/7. You don't care. You're distracted, you're a hyper consumer, and you're being manipulated. And you don't even realize that that's the case. We're essentially all addicted. And he says, because of that, our behavior, our resources, our opportunities, and our access to resources in society, and even the outcomes of society, they're all being controlled. They're all being manipulated by the structural system. And we're allowing it to happen because we're not individual thinkers from Mill's perspective. This is why I wanted to talk about him for social problems. This class, I've taught it many times, but, we often, we go along with the book and we follow the bureaucracy. And, sometimes as professors, we have fear of, if we go too far by asking students to think too much, we get too much pushback from students and from the bureaucratic system if we ask our students to think outside the box, or to be real critical thinkers, or to be independent thinkers. A lot of times, the bureaucracy in academia, the professors themselves, the students themselves, they want to just tell me what's in the book and then I'll regurgitate it back to you in a test. Don't ask me to do any more thinking or do any more intellectual labor than I absolutely have to. And so sometimes we want to ask students, or even ask of ourselves, to pull away from that, and to be more reflective and to be more critical in our thinking and our thought. But it's really challenging, because you absolutely receive pushback from all sides when you do that. Just like Mills, he received pushback from his colleagues, from his superiors, and from society as a whole. So the definition of sociological imagination by itself, right? So getting kind of to the crux of the definition. The ability to see that our particular problems and our successes as well are not unique to us, but the result of larger social trends. And he says, every individual's lives, from one generation to the next, in some society, he didn't say she, I added that, he or she lives out a biography, and he lives it out with some historical sequence. By the fact of his living, he contributes, however minutely, to the shaping of his society and its history, even as he is made by its society and its historical push and shove. So what does that mean? I can give you kind of the traditional answer, or the simple example, right, to help people understand. And that is, if you lose your job, you're probably going to think, what's wrong with me? You're not going to think, what's going on with the economy that I can't seem to find a job and I keep losing my job? We tend to think on a micro level. We tend to think as an individual to individual perspective. Our ability to see the macro level social structures and institutions and how they impact our everyday lives has been lost. In large part, it's been lost. It's a critical thinking skill we don't foster in the education system. It's one that is diminished, I would dare to say killed, when, we spend our days watching social media. And YouTube and, Facebook, Twitter, all of this, and all of the craziness. The ideas of the conspiracy theories getting and tricking people. It's a lack of ability for critical thinking skills, and it's a lack of sociological imagination. So a developed sociological imagination is the ability to see clearly and accurately the social structures, like what they are and how they work. And by social structures, we mean all of the institutions, the religious institutions, the political institutions, the economy, family as well is considered a social structure, the healthcare systems. All of these are social structures, and they impact our lives on both a macro and a micro level. So they impact all of us as a whole, but they also impact us as individuals. And you'll see people make arguments all the time, and the only argument that they seem to be able to make is the individual to individual argument, and they get stuck. They get stuck there and they miss the macro level argument. Or even when they attempt to, often it's like a system blame, they're trying to blame the system. They've so misread the way that the structure works that they are misinformed and therefore not accurately reading the system as a whole. And it's become, unfortunately quite problematic in our society. So C. Wright Mills said, or argued, that the only way to truly understand the experiences of our lives as individuals is to first understand the social institutional lives, the historical conditions that somebody was living under. So what he means by that is you can't understand somebody unless you understand the place and time from which they come. You don't know what it means to have grown up in, a war-torn country 50 years ago. And you don't know how you would have changed, right? So you think about yourself, put yourself in another place or another time. You have individual agency. Nobody says you don't. But who you are is shaped by the institutions around you, the norms around you, the time and the place around you. For many of us, if you're a person of color, if you're a woman, if you are not wealthy, many of us would not even have access to an education at all, not even a little bit. Not just not an access to a college degree, but you wouldn't even be getting a high school diploma. And so how would that have shaped your life, right? Or how does that shape people differently? And that's kind of what he means by a sociological imagination. It's the ability to see that, right? So it's, a better word might have been sociological awareness, right? So the ability to see the macro level impacts on the micro level. So the sociological imagination, as I'm reading here, says, enables its possessor to understand how place, time, and macro level social forces play a significant role in life circumstances of individuals. Is there a lack of access to jobs for everybody in your community? How does that shape your ability to feel like you can even move forward in life, or that you could even have an opportunity? Do you live in a food desert? Is there no access to healthy fruits and vegetables where you live? How does that shape somebody's life if you're a child growing up? There's no grocery stores. There's no fruits and vegetables. There's only fast food restaurants. Is there prisons nearby but no college? Are there no healthcare facilities, no hospitals, and no jobs, and no grocery stores? But there's a prison system, there's drugs, there's violence on the street. Those are the social structures that impact our lives, that shape who we become and who we are. So, getting tired. Mills explains that a lot of the bureaucratic rationality and technology doesn't mean that we're more intelligent. It's a misnomer, right? We tend to think we're more intelligent because we can Google things or because we're holding a phone in our hands everywhere we go. In reality, what he said was that it just made us more complacent, and it made sure that we weren't paying attention. That we were not independent intellectuals. The solution that he came up with were kind of a set of guidelines as well, is that he said to be better academics or intellectuals or just people in general, that we would have to continuously challenge bureaucracy. That we could be intelligent and informed, but we had to be independent thinkers. We couldn't follow the crowd. And in our case today would mean we can't hold a phone in our hand 24/7. And that we could break out of that toxic apathy that we have today. Mind you, he's talking the 60s, pre-phones, right? So we think about this today like toxic apathy. We all think about it as social media, but it didn't even exist in his time. He was saying, though, in his time, he saw it, and that bureaucracy lulled us into, kind of this apathy and complacency, and that we weren't challenging the system, and that there was just going to be an oligarchy, and there was not going to have, that we lacked the ability to have kind of an egalitarian society if we didn't break out of that. So based on that, like some of the strategies, right? In 1964, the C. Wright Mills Award was created. So it was 2 years after his death. He died young. I think he was in his 40s, like 46 or something, which is my age. And so in 1964, 2 years after his death, the Society for the Study of Social Problems created the C. Wright Mills Award for work that best exemplifies the spirit of his work. And essentially what they said it needed to follow was to critically address an issue of contemporary public importance, to bring to the topic a fresh imaginative perspective, advance social scientific understanding of the topic, display theoretical informed view of an empirical orientation, meaning you understand theory, the dead white guy's problem, right? And evidences quality in styling of writing, and explicitly or implicitly contains implications for course of action. And so in the spirit of the C. Wright Mills Award, our final project is going to be us making an attempt to move forward. And so it doesn't have to be a writing assignment or an intellectual assignment. But what I would like to do for our final project is that we find a topic or a social problem that we're interested in, and we make progress towards changing our own lives and going against kind of the standard status quo. Now, if that means, you're going to reduce your clothing and you're no longer going to buy fast fashion clothing so that you're not participating in child labor and the harm towards third world workers, or reducing your water usage and attempting to figure out a way to maybe reuse water in your home, or recycle water. If that means that you're going to reduce your trash and maybe create a worm garden or a garden so you're using food, or learn how to recycle. So we're going to talk later about some of these ideas, but I had been thinking about this type of class for years, and I've attempted to do it before, and I'm hoping with the best spirit in mind, in all hopes that you guys would be willing to go along this path with me. So this class is going to be less about intellectual reading and quiz taking. There's no midterm or final in the traditional sense. There's no multiple choice midterm or final, but I'm hoping that you will want to be a free thinker, and that you'll want to endeavor in a project of your own, and that you'll find some passion or work that you find interesting. I'm open to anything, but I also will be giving ideas for students who would like a little guidance, and we will be touching upon it throughout the semester. So I hope you enjoyed today's lecture, and you have a wonderful day, and that you can look forward towards the rest of the semester in the spirit of being a rebel academic.